Today, I'm going to be building and landing this fully functional Minmus science and ore refining base while I satisfy the contract, build a new surface outpost on Minmus. This video will assume you have already seen my earlier base building video. If you have not, you may want to check that one out first. In this video, I will be expanding upon those ideas by adding a science lab to the base. Having a lab on the surface does provide some additional bonuses. I will also be taking a look at using RTGs for the first time, the perfect electrical generator for surviving those long nights on the surface. In the process of constructing this base, I will be taking further advantage of the EVA Construction tools the game provides, and finally I will be continuing my look at ore refining and the advantages of having a refinery on the surface. Let's get started. And as always, we'll start by taking a look at the contract. Here it is, build a new surface outpost on Minmus. And the first thing I want to draw attention to here is please note that this must be a new outpost built for OMB Demolition Enterprises. So not an expansion on the Minmus base I already started. All the components have to be launched after accepting this contract. But then I thought, that's just going to be fine, because in the previous two videos we were talking about ore extraction and we were working around the moon, and I really do think actually Minmus is a better target for this, and I do think it's better to refine your ore on the surface using a base. So we're going to find a nice high concentration ore location and situate our base there. But let's go through the various things. There's the usual new outpost with an antenna docking port and can generate power. Again, the outpost must be fully assembled when launched. That's only this portion of it. The rest of this you can add on with additional new modules. Has to be able to support at least 10 KERBALs, have 2 scientists on the outpost, must have the mobile processing lab, and must maintain stability for 10 seconds, and you have to land it onto Minmus. So let's go scout out a good location for that base. This satellite on its way to Minmus is housing the M700 survey scanner. This entire vessel is identical to the one that put this scanner in orbit about the moon. So if you want the build, you'll find it in that episode. You will often find that vessels designed for the moon are perfectly serviceable for Minmus and vice versa. There is going to be a lot of launches in this video, so to keep the length manageable, I'm going to be taking advantage of previously built vessels where I can. I'll just remind you that the M700 scanner must be placed into a polar orbit about the body you intend to scan. There are also some altitude restrictions to pay attention to. In the VAB, I can see that it must be inserted into an orbit with an altitude between 25 kilometers and 300 kilometers, not 1500 kilometers, because 5 times Minmus's radius of 60 kilometers is the smaller of the two numbers. Be careful with stuff like that. I put this one into a 100 kilometer orbit, and when I performed the orbital survey, I found that my base from that previous video was luckily already in a solid location for ore refining. So I decided to send a crew out to that old base to further investigate the region. But before we get into all this, I do want to unlock some new tech. I mean, for goodness sakes, I have 2,875 science points. I gotta start spending them. So here's where we're gonna go. Okay, we're gonna go looking down here towards the bottom right of the tech tree and getting towards the end. And the first one I'm gonna look at is experimental science, because I want this M4435 narrow band scanner so that we can really zero in where this high ore concentration is. And also this gives me a large holding tank, which will help me out when building my harvester. So I'm going to unlock that one, and then we're going to work our way down to specialized electrics. This node does come for this really nice 4,000 electric charge 2.5 meter battery. It also comes with this large fuel cell array, both of which are both very useful, but the main reason I'm unlocking this node is to get to the next one, experimental electrics, for the PB Nuke radioisotope thermal electric generator. This is an RTG. this solves your problems with generating electricity when everything goes dark. So we're going to unlock that one as well. And let's get our crew. And as I've already been to the Minmus base, I'm just going to use the same vehicle I've done before. This was mission 23. Here it is right here. And we are going to modify a couple of very simple things. So number one is the magnetometer. I have collected all the magnetometer science there is in and around Minmus. It doesn't work on the surface. There's just high space, low space, and I've done that. So that's coming off. But what's new is, since I built this thing, I've now unlocked the GravMax negative gravioli detector. There's some new science there. We're going to stick that on instead. We're also going to modify our rover that we have there so that we can go and do some surveying. So we're going to need the surface scanning module for that. I'm going to click that on there, and we're going to use a KERBAL to attach that onto our rover. And we're also going to grab the M4435 narrow band scanner. We're going to put that on our rover too. I just got to find a place. I'm going to stick it. It's just got to be somewhere I think that'll work. Just to be kind of out of the way. And we're also, because this thing will not have a pilot, we're going to put a probe body aboard. So I'm just going to sneak it underneath this parachute here. We're going to grab an Octo 2 probe body, stick that right there. Put that there. Oh, maybe get the translate tool, slide that down a bit, and nobody's the wiser. And let's take a look at our crew for this little expedition. The contract requires us to have 2 scientists aboard, and for that we have Alejandro and Banditu Kerman, for which a Minmus landing will get them to level 2. Also along is our level 2 engineer Danilo. Not only will she be necessary for the EVA construction that I'll be doing, but don't forget that an engineer greatly boosts the rate at which you harvest and refine your ore. As mentioned, we'll be sending a lot of crafts to Minmus in this video, something I've detailed in the past, but just to go over the main points here, I like to launch myself into a 6-degree inclined orbit, matching Minmus's inclination, but to actually match the plane of Minmus's orbit, you need to launch at the right time, which is when the KSC passes directly under Minmus's orbit, which will occur either at the ascending or descending node. Just take note of whether you need to head 6 degrees to the north or to the south. In this case, I'm launching to the north. I like this method because it makes the necessary mid-course correction burn trivial, or sometimes not even necessary. I've had people tell me that they find this too fiddly. To each their own, but honestly, if you can launch into a heading of 90 degrees, it's no more difficult to adjust that heading 6 degrees to the north or south, which is all you have to do. Either way, make sure that your incoming trajectory at Minmus is inclined enough so that the latitude of the point furthest north or south of the equator is higher than the latitude of your landing site. If the inclination of your parking orbit is too low, then the landing site won't pass below the orbit. Either way, once landed and docked at the old base, it was pretty easy to put the new survey equipment on the rover that was already there. And according to the survey scanner, the ore concentration right at this base is 14.04%. I did some exploring around, but couldn't get the concentration over 14.06%. It's too bad the base has to be new, as the old one would have sufficed nicely. But it does have to be new, so I dropped a waypoint just under 1 kilometer away from the old base and got ready to send up the first component of our new base. So our new core is just going to be identical to the previous base core, so I'm just going to reuse this same vessel to bring that out there, but we are going to do some modifications. For instance, if I go into cargo, there is a ton of cargo here, most of which was there to build that little rover that we were using. We're not going to need any of that, so we're just going to take all of this and just get rid of it. This will save us a ton of weight. But I do want to add some new things to this base that the previous base doesn't have. And that is this long set of docking tubes here. And this will keep the harvester well away from the habitational portion of our base. But I'm not going to bring this up in a vessel. Instead, our KERBALs are going to construct this part. Now, if we take a look at it, it's made up of 4 docking ports and 8 of these structural fuselages, so we're going to need to bring that up. So let's get back to our vessel and take advantage of the storage space we just freed up, and also take advantage of the weight we just shedded. So if I go back into cargo here, I want to have some docking ports. So these are the regular clamp-o-trons. We're going to put these in, and oh, that's already filling that up. So let's put them down here. There we go. We're gonna have to have three down here and 1 up there. And I'm also going to put on a couple of extra landing struts, because I think I'm gonna need that support on that tube before all the rest of the modules are connected. And the rest of this, if I go to the structural fuselages, they don't fit in here. And it's not just because they're too big, it's because this is as the note here says, this part cannot be placed in a storage container. But that doesn't mean we can't bring them up there. All we gotta do, let's go regular placement here, is we need 8 of them. Okay, fine, I'm gonna go up here. These aren't particularly heavy. We're gonna go to 4-way symmetry, put on the snap, and just kind of find a spot to stick them. We'll have a KERBAL tearing them off. Yeah, that works okay. And then another, oh wait, that's going in. I'll have to readjust the fairing here a little bit. And then another 4 down here. I mean, the fairing's already ginormous. It doesn't hurt to be a little bit bigger. And if we go down, the one thing we did adjust the mass. I think the center of thrust and all of that kind of stuff should be absolutely fine. And if we take a look at our launch thrust to weight ratio, it's gone from 1.33 to 1.32, which means I really didn't adjust the masses all that much. Vacuum delta V's are still just fine, so I'm just gonna fly this thing. Maybe tweak up the thrust on this bottom engine just a smidge. And actually, one last moment thing that I realized right at the end is that the only solar generation on this entire vessel are these deployable solar panels up here on the base. But with what I just added, those things will not be able to be extended. So I added on 4 additional Oxstat solar panels on the transfer stage just to keep this thing powered up on its way to Minmus. But with that all done, this thing was ready to fly. Now, one thing, if you're trying to, oh, it just switched to orbit. I'm going to go back to surface. There we go. So it locks back onto that 83-degree heading, so I can keep an eye. It'll keep pulling up that inclination. The reason why I do that is when it goes to orbit, it's going to get back to that your current orbital heading, and I want my heading actually to be a little bit past 84 degrees. So kind of be on the lookout for that. That's a little tip to try and get this right on 6, and then once it's right on 6 degrees, pop that back to orbit, and you should be able to ride up that inclination exactly what you want it to be. Okay, let's pop the fairing. There we go. There we go, 6 degrees. Now I go back to orbit, not target, orbit. There we go. And now it should be just riding that right on an 84-degree heading all the way up. This allows you to dial in the inclination of your parking orbit to whatever it is you want. After that, the transfer out to Minmus is, of course, exactly the same as what we just saw. All the modules for this base are going to employ the same technique I'm using for this base module. The transfer stage is jettisoned a little above the surface after our speed has been reduced to almost 0, with a small Skycrane to handle the final touchdown. And by Skycrane, I simply mean an upside-down decoupler on top of the module, followed by a probe core, antenna, a collection of twitch radial engines, and enough fuel to give it about 100 meters per second of delta V. After touchdown, the Skycrane can simply be separated, after which it'll crash somewhere away from the site. With our new base module in place, it was time for our engineer Danilo to traverse the short distance with our rover and begin construction of the docking tube. This is once again a topic I covered in detail in the past. That said, EVA Construction is actually pretty intuitive, as it uses all the same tools and shortcuts you have available in the VAB and Spaceplane hangar, though there are a couple of additional things to keep in mind. You do need an engineer for this, and that KERBAL's reach is about 10 meters. If the part gets highlighted in orange, you are outside the KERBAL's range. There is also a mass limit to the parts that can be moved. That limit can be increased with more kerbals on EVA, though in Minmus's low gravity, each kerbal can lift 1.2 tons, so we're not going to be running into a problem here. You can only move one part at a time, so you can't move parts with other parts attached to them. And finally, you cannot move the root part of the assembly. This construction went really well. I even thought I wasn't going to need to support that long tube. That is until ditching the Skycrane removed the probe body, which removed the SAS control along with it. Looking at this now, I'm pretty sure I could have regained SAS by simply moving Danilo into the cupola module, but instead I just propped up the tube with those landing struts I brought. I'll remove these ugly things once all the modules for the base have been attached. Speaking of which, after bringing over the rest of the crew in the lander, it was time to build our lab module. So this is the current state of our new Minmus base, but the contract is not satisfied yet because there are some conditions that we still have to meet. First here, we have to have a facility supporting at least 10 kerbals. Right now, this supports 8. There are 3 spots in the lander here. There is 1 spot in the cupola module, and further 4 in the hitchhiker. That adds up to 8. So I need to add on 2 more. I also need to have the mobile processing lab on my outpost. Thankfully, the Mobile Processing Lab has 2 more slots for Kerbal, so that will satisfy both having the Mobile Processing Lab and getting me up to 10. So what I want to do now is I want to add on the Mobile Processing Lab. And since this is going to be a completely new build, I'll go through this one in detail. And we're going to add the Mobile Processing Lab on this node right here. So I'm going to start off by grabbing me a Clampotron docking port. Flipping that around, sticking that on here. And if we go into science, there's our mobile processing lab. Now, I can stick it right on the end. It'll let me do that, but I don't want that. I want it to be standing upright. I think that'll look much better. But there is no node on the side here, and you'll see it won't let me stick it on there. Now, you might go, oh, okay, you need to get one of them radial attachment points. If I go into structure, there's the BZ-52 radial attachment point, and although that will attach fine onto the docking port, it still doesn't provide a node for the lab module. But I'm not sunk. We're going to take advantage of sub-assemblies to get this to work. So what I'm going to do, yeah, let's throw this away for now. Temporarily save what you got so far, because we're going to be throwing this away. So make sure this is saved. Then I'm going to grab my lab, and I'm just going to stick it anywhere. I'm just going to stick it up top here. I'm making sure it's right side up. I'm just looking at the textures. It is. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is grab that radial attachment point that I had just a moment ago. There it is. And I can stick that on here, make sure the snap is on, just generally. But what this does is provide me with another node. So you might be going, oh great, I can now stick that on there. No, because the end of this is still the active node. See how that works? So what we need to do is put this into a subassembly. So we're going to open up our subassembly windows. We're going to grab, well, any other part will do. I'm going to grab another one of these radial attachment points here, stick it on the end, make that the root part. Then we're going to throw this away. This is why I saved. We're going to grab this. We're going to open up our subassemblies. We're going to throw this into the subassembly load. Leave it unnamed. It really doesn't matter because we're going to be getting rid of it in just a little bit. Let's go all new again. Don't save this. Open up our Minmus basis. Again, remember this is why I saved it. But now I can go into here, grab this, and I will find that I now have an active node there on the side. Boom, there we go. So there is our lab module on there the way we want it. Now I do want to put on some landing struts because this thing is going to be sitting on the surface. And then I'm also going to use the same trick I used for the lander by using these small landing gear. 2 more on the other side. And with those in place, we need to make sure that the landing gear and the wheels are at the same height as they are for the whole rest of the base. So we'll grab all of this, slide it down to the surface to the landing legs that are on the existing one are just clipping into the ground, and now I can adjust this. Now what I'm actually going to lift up the entire lab module rather than raise the gear. So I'm just going to come up like this. So let's just do it just for the wheels, so the wheels are just touching just clipping into the surface, and then I'll grab these landing struts. Do the same thing for those. That seems to be pretty darn equal. Okay, we can grab this all now, slide her up. Goody good. We can retract these. Retract these, as they will go up in a retracted position. And now what I'm going to do, I want to cover up this bottom bit a little bit. So I'm going to, because I know electricity is going to be something I got to think about, take my new Z-4K rechargeable battery banks, and I'm going to drop 2 of them down there on the bottom. And it does a nice little job of hiding these guys. These guys will still extend below that. So that ends up hiding those legs a little bit. Maybe tuck them in a little, so that when this base is all done, my little cheat on how I got the modules all together will not be so apparent. And then I'll put on a couple of extendable ladders for our kerbals to go up and down. And then we're going to build a little bit of a tower up here on the top. So I'm going to grab the Rockomax brand adapter 2. Going to grab this modular girder adapter, other way like that. And I'm going to grab 2 of these modular girder segments. Now, remember that the lab uses up a lot of electricity. 5 units of electric charge per second when you have those scientists in there processing data. And processing that data takes a long time. So it's really nice if it will continue to work through the night. The Minmus night is about 1 Kerbal day long, about 6 hours long. And at 5 electric charge per second, well, if you do that little bit of multiplying, you'll find out that that's 108,000 units of electric charge. Just to throw that into perspective, these big batteries I just threw down here are only 8,000 units, so there's no way I'm covering that with batteries. Now, to be completely honest, the science will continue to be processed when the lab is not rendered, when you're off doing something else. It gets processed in the background, and when it's in the background, it doesn't use up electricity. So you can cheat this by just simply making sure that you're not processing the science while you're there at night. But I don't know, I kind of like to make this something that actually would work if that little game mechanic wasn't there. So what can I do? I can't put in batteries. I could use fuel cells, so that will start to burn up a lot of fuel. That said, I will end up putting on a harvester and converter so I can continue to make that fuel, so that will work. But what I'm going to do instead is use my newly unlocked RTGs. If I go over to electrical, I have right here the PB Nuke radioisotope thermoelectric generator, and it will produce 0.8 units per second, and these are not very big. Let's just throw, there's 2 of them. Let's just put 1 of them. They're not very big. They only weigh 80 kilograms each, so you can stack these up pretty easily. And by the way, this 0.8 units of electric charge per second is constant. The generator is always active, always going, and it never runs out. It will be just there forever. So to cover my 5 units of electric charge per second, what I'm going to do is put on 8 of them. So I'm just going to simply put it on 8-way symmetry. Just like, no, I'm going to, sorry, 4-way symmetry. I could get away with 8-way symmetry around here, but I don't know. Although these things don't generate heat in the game, in my mind, these radiator fins are on here for a reason, so I like to give a little bit of air around them, and then so I put 4 like that, and then notice there are nodes there, so you can just stack another 4 on top there. That looks fine, and that will take care of the electric charge stuff forever. Now, just for looksy-looksies, I'm actually going to still put on, just as a backup, 2 of these AUX-10C photovoltaic panels. I'll be honest, mostly because I just really like the look of them. I don't really need them. I am going to put them on, and I want them to be functional, so they're going to run, I put them on parallel to the panels that are already existing on the HAB module. So that will look pretty good. And also, we're going to be transmitting the science. A Communitron will do, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick the fastest antenna I've unlocked to date, which is the Communitron HG-55, which can transmit at 20 MITs per second. Just a single one of them. There's no point having more than one, doesn't do you anything. Right about here. Let's see what that looks like when it's extended. Ah, lovely. Perfect. Okay, that is great. Now this little lab module does need to drive into its position here, so that means I'm going to do the same thing I did here. I'm going to use RCS for that, so that means I'm going to have to put on some monoprop on this module. I'm going to grab 2 of the Stratus 5 roundified monoprops. I'm going to stick them just down here, and yeah, I'll just tuck them in so they're a little bit out of the way. You can just put them there and forget about them. And then we're going to have to drive, and we're only going to ever drive in one direction. So I'm going to go under Command and Control. I'm going to grab the Place Anywhere 7 linear RCS thruster port. These are the bigger ones. Don't grab the smaller ones. Well, you can, but you won't have as much thrust. I'm going to put 2 of them down here. Get them on two-way symmetry, so I got another one on the other side. So that'll allow me to drive forward and backwards. I'm going to right-click on them, show the actuation toggles. The only thing I care about is forward and aft, so all the rest of these can come off. So we'll do that. And then I want to put another pair up above, and I want it to be somewhat balanced. I mean, Minmus's gravity is pretty light, and if you have an unbalanced one, you can definitely tilt this thing over. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this docking port temporarily the root part. We're going to move that away so that only our lab module is showing. Put on the center of mass, and I'm just going to eyeball this and put another pair of thrusters about the same distance above the center. Oh, maybe right on, why not? Right on the little doober-dobs there. And now I can put this back. There we go. And that's pretty much the lab module. You know, I did have to add on some lights. I ended up adding on 4 Illuminator Mark IIs up there on the tower to light up the area around the lab, as well as 4 red flashing lights right at the top of the tower. And then I was thinking, there's a lot of gear still in that old base. It'd be nice to be able to move it over. So I thought I would bring up some cargo containers so that I can turn that rover into a moving van. So I also added on 2 SEQ-3 cargo storage units and 2 SEQ-3C conformal storage units. I don't really have a plan here. I figure I'll be able to make use of at least some of these parts, but we'll use the lab module to bring them up there. And now it's time to get this thing into the VAB, so I made sure to save my base as it sits right now, got rid of everything but the lab module, and then switched over to the VAB. And we're going to place this onto the surface using the exact same process I did for the other lab modules. We're going to put on a Skycrane. Now the Skycrane's only going to handle the last bit of this. So what I ended up doing was simply putting on a TD-060 decoupler. We're going to put that upside down so it will leave with the Skycrane. We're going to turn the force percentage right off so that we can get rid of our Skycrane without too much drama. Then I'm going to put on 2 of the octagonal struts, like so. I'm going to put on a probe body, the Octo 2 probe body to be precise, and we're going to immediately make this the root part so that we will be controlling from there. Then I'm going to go back into structural. I'm going to grab the FL-A5 adapter to get up to a 2.5 meter size. Into control, we're going to grab some advanced reaction wheels because there are none on this as of right now. And for fuel, we really don't need much. I'm just going to grab one of these R-12 donut external fuel tanks, just like so. And for propulsion, we're going to use 4 twitches. Now, you do want to make sure that the twitches come out a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some cubic octagonal struts like so. We're going to go on 4-way symmetry, and then we're going to put our twitches onto the end of those like that. And if we put this on vacuum and move this decoupler out of the way, because the engines will come on and then the decoupler comes on at the end, that gets me 123 meters per second and a thrust to weight ratio 0.92 for Minmus. That's going to be more than adequate. And this can handle then the last part of the descent, the actual touchdown bit. One thing though that's really easy to have happen is that the exhaust from these twitches can be occluded by the structure that is below it, and you really want to test this. And upon testing, I found that I needed to rotate them out just a little bit. So I'm going to take the snap off and just roll them out just a little bit so the exhaust comes a little bit to the side. Technically that does reduce the amount of thrust that I have, but it doesn't matter, I have more than enough. And again, like I said, you want to test this, and to test this, what you want to do is you just want to put it out on the launch pad, press Alt F12, go into your cheap menu, set an orbit, and put yourself in orbit. Anywhere will do, but we'll just use the default, putting it in Kerbal. Put on your SAS, lock it onto a vector like you either want prograde or retrograde so that you'll really be affecting your speed. Activate your engines and punch it. And you want to see your speed changing. If it's not changing, that means the exhaust is being occluded and you need to make some adjustments. As you can see, this is working just fine. We're cut our engines, and we're going to revert back to our vehicle assembly building and continue our build. And after the addition of a Commutron 16 so that this thing can fly autonomously, I came to the point where I had to enclose this in some kind of fairing. So I'm going to get another TD-060 coupler, flip it upside down. We're going to stick it up there on the top. I'm then going to get a fairing, 1.25 meter fairing. We're going to flip that upside down. We're going not build the fairing just yet. Now this feels a little tight, so what I'm going to do is turn on the interstage nodes, bring this up a little bit so that there's a little bit of clearance there. We're going to put a nose cone on the top, and we're going to put on a Separatron. Stick that on the side, flip it upside down, take out almost all of the fuel. So the idea being that this Separatron will blow the nose cone off when we're ready to get rid of it, and then we're going to just simply slide that in. Don't need to worry about getting it right in the middle. In fact, it's a little better if it's a little bit off so that the nose cone will fire off towards the side, and then we're simply going to build the fairing down. And I'm just going to enclose the top part of this. I'm not going to worry too much about the docking port and the landing legs. I figure I can deal with the drag. I got to tell you, one of the most common comments I get, especially on my shorts, are people complaining about drag. I mean, for goodness sakes, folks, this rocket spends so little time in the lower part of the atmosphere. I mean, don't be stupid about it, but a little bit of drag is not a big deal. It honestly doesn't matter. But with that now complete, it was time for the transfer vehicle. That was simply a TD-25 decoupler, followed by 3 X200-16 fuel tanks, and then a Poodle engine. This transfer stage can do everything from the upper part of our insertion into low Kerbal orbit all the way to Minmus and most of the descent down to Minmus's surface. For the launch vehicle, it was another TD-25 decoupler, an X200-32 fuel tank, followed by an X200-64, and then the mainsail engine there on the bottom, and then 4 small fins for a little bit of additional stability. After tweaking the mainsail down to give us an appropriate launch thrust-to-weight ratio, we were ready to fly. And we still have 2 more launches to get up what we need for the ore refining part of this base. But for now, with the addition of this module, the requirements for the contract at the center of this tutorial have been met. And it didn't take long to collect enough science to fill up our lab. So in went our 2 scientists to begin processing that sweet, sweet data. Again, this is something I've talked about in the past, but basically, instead of collecting the science, you send it to the lab to be processed. The amount of data is equal to the amount of science that would normally be recovered, plus 25% if the lab is situated in the same SOI, which it is, and a further 10% if it's situated on the surface, which again it is. Once in the lab, over time, our 2 scientists will process that data into science that can be transmitted back to the KSC. The amount of science you eventually get will be 5 times the data you collected. It is pretty obvious the lab can generate a lot of science for us, but our scientists aren't the only ones that are busy. Our engineer Danilo had to convert our surveying rover into a moving van, after which she drove back to the old base to collect what remained of the gear we left there. But with that, we're going back into the spaceplane hangar to look at our next module. So here's my final goal for the base. It's got 2 more modules still to add. Over way at the end here, we have our combination ore miner and refinery that will be taking that ore and turning it into useful resources. So we'll be going over this build in just a little bit, but let's start with the simpler one because those resources need to be stored somewhere. So over here, I just simply have a tank. So let's go over this one just really quick. It's really very simple. It's built around an empty X200-32 fuel tank. Of course, landing gear and the familiar wheeled landing gear that we're going to use to drive this into place and dock it onto the rest of the base. I put in 2 again of the Stratus 5 Round 5 monoprop tanks and the linear RCS ports with everything disabled except for forward and aft so that we can drive it along. I just went for just a change 3-way symmetry on the docking ports and then a little bit of a tower very similar to the tower that's on the lab module. We have the Rockomax adapter 2, a modular girder adapter, then a modular girder, some Mark 1 illuminators on the top, some red flashy lights on the top, and some amber flashy lights here in the middle, and really that's about it. Let's switch over to the VAB. We'll take a look at the launch vehicle. Here, let's focus in on the top here first. We'll remove this whole business. This is the Skycrane on the top. Again, TD-06 decoupler, an octagonal strut, just for the fuel, because this thing's much lighter, just a single Oxcarbee fuel can, an Octo 2 probe core, which I made the root part, so that that's what we'll be controlling from. Again, an adapter piece, a set of the advanced reaction wheels, some cubic octagonal struts, and then 4 of the Twitch engines, again angled out ever so slightly so that the exhaust is not occluded. This one doesn't have the RTGs to power it, so I did give it its own 4 Oxstat solar panels and just a couple of batteries so that I don't run out of juice while it's out there. On the top here, for the fairing, we have a TD-12 decoupler this time. Fairing flip, both of which flipped upside down, both the fairing and the TD-5 decoupler. A Separatron tucked in there to blow the nose cone away, nose cone on the top, built the fairing around. Again, not worrying about any drag associated with these docking ports, it really doesn't matter. For the launch vehicle, because again this thing is lighter, very similar, this time though just 2 Rockomax X200-8 fuel cans instead of the 3 that was on the previous vessel, and then an RE-1110 Poodle with the thrust limiter turned down a little bit because the thrust to weight ratio was actually quite extreme. And then for the booster on the bottom, again things are just really just scaled down from before. Again, a Jumbo 64 fuel can, but then just the smaller X200-16 fuel tank on top. On the bottom, a skipper, and then 4 tail fins, and with the thrust on the skipper tweaked down to give me an appropriate launch thrust to weight ratio. So that is that one. Let's take a look at the harvester. On the harvester end, we have the large holding tank for ore. Emptied out, can hold up to 1,500 units of ore. Of course, attached with a docking port to the rest. No other docking ports on this thing. I figured this will be this end of the base. Though I did put docking ports at the end of this one in case, I don't know, in the future I ever decide to continue to expand on this thing. We have the large Drill-O-Matic mining extractors, which are more efficient than the smaller juniors that you saw me using in a previous video. But that's because this vessel, once it's landed, is there. So mass isn't something that's a big deal. Again, little wheels on the bottom, push it into place. RCS linear thruster ports with monoprop, again tucked up here in the tower. And of course the landing struts there. Moving on up, we have the convert-o-tron 250, again much more efficient than the smaller 125, so definitely use that unless mass really is an issue for you. Very similar, whoops, I gotta go up, there we go. Very similar power structure to the lab module, the girder adapter, and then 2 of these modular girder segments on top of that. Some Mark II illuminators and blinky red lights on top. I talked in detail about cooling and electrical consumption in that ore harvesting video, but to go over the gist of it, you need to add up the required cooling for both drills and the convert-o-tron. Here this added up to 400 kilowatts. Under the radiators, you need to look at the core heat transfer number. And make sure that you total at least this much. I used 2 medium thermal control units, giving me a total core heat transfer of 500 kilowatts. These are deployable radiators, which is nice because they'll work from anywhere on the build, while the static radiators need to be placed right next to what it is that they're cooling. For the required electrical generation, total up the EC requirements for the drills and converter, but realize that the surface ore percentage and engineer level will modify the harvesting and refining rates, bringing the EC cost below what it says here. All the math is covered in that ore harvesting video. Suffice to say, I had this covered easily with my 2 Gigantor extra large solar arrays. Let's switch to the VAB and look at the delivery vehicle. This one's a little heavier, so it needed to get a little bit bigger. This time, the entire fairing is actually here at the bottom. There's no nose cone being blown off. I just put on a 2.5 meter fairing and then just built the fairing around the whole thing. Let's delete that so we can look inside. Going up here, again, familiar Skycrane here on the top. TD-060 coupler, 2 octagonal struts, Octo 2 probe core, adapter, advanced inline reaction wheels. Again, for electricity, we got a couple of batteries, some Oxstat solar panels, a Communitron as well. Don't forget that. The previous one had the Communitron. I just forgot to show it to you. Strutted it down so it's a little less wobbly up there. Needed a bit more fuel than before, so for fuel, we have the FL-T100 fuel tank, and then, once again, some octagonal struts, some twitch engines, and a further R-12 donut external fuel tank on the top. Coming down for the transfer vehicle, I wanted to put a little bit of space in here so I could build the fairing around, so there's actually just the smaller TD-12 decoupler, a couple of octagonal struts, then the fairing itself, 3 of the Rockomax X200-8 fuel cans, underneath of which went the Poodle engine, so that's actually the identical pusher that you saw with the lab module. For the actual booster itself, we have an X200-8 fuel tank and then the Rockomax Jumbo-64 with, of course, the mainsail here on the bottom. This time I went with 6 of these smaller fins. This thing is a little bit bigger and need a little bit more help, so attached here radially through some TT-70 radial decouplers are 2 more Rockomax 64 fuel tanks, some advanced big nose cones on the top, and for the engines, didn't need the mainsail, so I went down a size to the RE-I5 Skipper liquid fuel engine. Now, all 3 of these engines are all going off at launch, so to get an appropriate launch thrust to weight ratio, I turned down the thrust limiter on just the Skipper engines. The mainsail engine is still at full thrust, and we are using some asparagus staging. Here is the fuel line feeding from here to here, so these 2 radial tanks will be drained first. Once they're drained, we stage, and then we'll be on this central core, and we got some separatrons there to push away, help with the staging, and some additional strutting to help stiffen this whole rocket up, and that's pretty much the whole thing. Okay, let's go do these missions. We'll start off with the holding tank, and while it makes its way to our Minmus outpost, I'm going to take this opportunity to welcome aboard my most recent Patreon patron, Dr. Jekyll. Thank you very much for your support, and of course that appreciation extends to all of my Patreon patrons and YouTube members who continue to support this channel. In fact, it was their input that is responsible for the continuation of this series after the early release of KSP2. So if you are liking what you are seeing here, you may also consider joining this most awesome group. The links are down in the description. I think a surface base, especially once you've unlocked the RTGs, is a much better option for ore refining than the orbital station you saw me complete last episode. It makes more sense to refine the ore right on the surface rather than using precious fuel to get that ore into orbit to be refined. Speaking of RTGs, some of you may be wondering why I used solar to power the refinery module rather than RTGs. RTGs would definitely work. Remember, harvesting and refining ore takes hours rather than the days it takes to process science, so it's pretty easy to avoid having to run the refinery at night. And while on the topic of science, this refinery will also keep that lander fully fueled, allowing it to hop to any other biome on Minmus so it can keep sending new science home, as well as feeding science data to the science lab. Not only can the refined fuel be used for science collecting, but with the addition of a fuel hauling lander to the base, you can bring that fuel to other stations in orbit about Minmus, the Moon, or KERBAL. Minmus is the ideal location for a base like this, as the cost of getting back into orbit is much less than it is for the Moon. And as our crew work to make their new outpost feel like home, why don't I use this opportunity to go over the main takeaways from this episode? I spent some time going over the build of the lab module, in particular exploring the benefits of using RTGs to power your base through the night. I also looked at how to use the game's subassembly feature to control what is going to be the active node on a collection of parts. I looked at how to use the orbital information as well as the nav ball to insert yourself into a parking orbit with a precise inclination. This skill will help make your transfer out to Minmus easier. And finally, I talked about the advantages that a surface base provides over an orbital station, both when it comes to refining ore and using the science lab. And with that, I'm going to be drawing this episode to a close. I hope you found it useful, and that I'll be seeing you again for the next one.